Dear Rob, dear colleagues, it's a pleasure and a privilege to make some comments to stimulate the discussion here on this very interesting talk and also on this really interesting book. So for the preparation of the comments, I looked mostly at the book, but I'm happy. I look forward to also comment on the main summary you had here. In the book, food politics is defined as the struggle over how gains and losses from state action are allocated in the food and farming sector. And I think that is a very good summary also of what you described. So food politics is about what the state can and cannot do and how different interest groups influence that. And I can really recommend reading the book. It provides a wealth of information in a very accessible form. And it's organized around questions that are contested in the political debate, which makes it a very fascinating read. And as we also have seen in the summary, it challenges conventional thinking and debunks quite a number of myths in a field that is very much dominated by misinformation. So I think, indeed, the book says what everyone needs to know. However, there are some points where I would like to offer a somewhat different perspective. One is the Green Revolution story. So the argument, especially as presented here, is that the Green Revolution has a lot of potential. It solved the food problem in the Asian countries, but it's this counterculture that looks at organic food and slow food. The critics of the Green Revolution are kind of the culprits of why this Green Revolution isn't happening in Africa. Maybe that's a bit of an overstatement, but I believe that one has to look from a bit different perspective at that. And I would actually take issue with this point that the dominant factor are the environmental groups in the West. And perhaps we can better understand this point if we look at the point, what was the Green Revolution? In the book, the Green Revolution is mainly a story about technology. It's about success in plant breeding, and then the farmers adopt the new technologies. That's the Green Revolution story. But I think the available evidence shows that the Green Revolution was much more about politics than it was about technology. So many of you may know that story. India was very dependent on American food aid in the 1960s, and Lyndon Johnson used that as a political tool, which is actually also acknowledged in the book. And as the autobiography of the Minister of Agriculture in India at that time showed, it was this use of food aid as a political tool that created the impetus for the Indian government that had fought for many years to be independent. That created the political impetus for the Green Revolution. It was a political decision to become food self-sufficient. It was only this political environment that created the political will to do everything that's needed for smallholders to adopt these technologies. And this autobiography tells that very clearly from the perspective of a politician, how difficult it was to get the seed systems and everything in place, how difficult it was to remove the regulations, to get a minimum support price. So there was a lot of political effort. It didn't just happen because this technology was there. And what is also a very important aspect of that, which could perhaps also be discussed in the book, can the smallholders actually feed their countries? An essential of the feature of the Green Revolution was that the smallholders can actually do that, which was not commonly accepted at that time. And there's another political aspect to it, that the smallholders had political power in the Asian countries, and that the political legitimacy of the Asian regime depended on achieving food security. I think that's very important to understand also the African situation. So why did the Green Revolution not reach Africa? I mean, in your summary, we heard maybe the environmental groups play an important role by discouraging governments to do that. In my own interaction, I have to say, with African politicians, I have actually not had the impression so far that it is really these environmental groups from the West that are discouraging that. The book gives, again, a technology story why the Green Revolution did not reach Africa. International assistance agencies introduced variety that were not sufficiently adapted. The agroecology is more complex. But I think, again, we have to understand that's a very political story. There's a recent book that underlines that. African countries had a lot of similar intervention than the Asian countries. Yeah, they also provided input subsidy. They tried to get new seeds. They invested in irrigation. But one important difference was that the African countries lacked the accountability for the outcomes. Many of them were dictatorships. They could just survive without providing food security. And another important point, they had an anti-smallholder bias that persists until today. So what the future of farming is for Africa, I'm not so sure whether it is really so much influenced by environmental groups. It may be rather influenced by large-scale investors who right now investing or trying to invest quite a lot in African agriculture. You all know about the so-called land grab debate. So maybe there's a quite different mechanisms maybe at work than were presented here. And I think the question still remains how to create a conducive conditions for smallholders while avoiding some of the mistakes that the Asian countries have made. There may be some other issues that are not discussed, like how can agriculture adapt to climate change. I would also like to draw attention to one issue which is quite important regarding this agricultural policy. You mentioned here that the industrialized countries still continue to subsidize their agricultural sector. The book also draws attention to the fact that for a long time, the developing countries have actually taxed or discriminated against the agricultural sector. But one very important finding, and I think that's important to note, is, as Kim Anderson presented here at IFPRI last year, a new study shows that the developing countries have actually reduced the taxation of the agricultural sector. This is the nominal rate of assistance to agriculture on that diagram. So if that is negative, then the farmer gets a lower price than he or she would get otherwise. So we see that this, especially for crops that can be exported, this discrimination of agriculture has largely disappeared. And I think that was a major shift in support of smallholders, which could be explained. How about biotechnology? You didn't mention it in your summary. The book has a chapter on that. And it asks the question, can genetically engineered food help solve global hunger problems? And I think you make very important points on this question, that if biotechnology is about to solve global hunger problems, there should be much more public investment, which at the moment is also jeopardized by the environmental movement you describe. But again, I think here the book offers a technology solution. And I think we have to acknowledge that even if these technologies would be available, they are not a substitute for the need to get the institutional conditions right. For example, if you don't have a functioning seed certification system, which very few African countries have at the moment, even if you have this technology available, so even if your environmental group wouldn't resist that technology, still there would be a lot of other conditions to be put in place to make that actually work. We could also talk about genetically modified food in Europe. I think the book makes the very important point that the resistance in Europe is due to the fact that consumers just do not see benefits. I think that's a very important point that's made. There's also discussion on the food and environmental safety of GMOs, which is, of course, one very contentious issue among environmental groups. I think one could actually acknowledge that there is a risk of allergens in the food chain from GMO and potential agronomic problems. The question is rather, does the industry have enough own incentives to actually avoid these kind of problems, or how much regulation do we need? Maybe that would be one perspective on that. The final point, which is also the final chapter in the book, who governs the world food system and how powerful are the international organizations? That is also a very fascinating chapter to read. The World Food Programme gets a very positive assessment, which I think is very well justified. Its contribution to avoiding famine is highlighted. The World Trade Organization, also in your talk, it's a very rather negative assessment. It has not reduced the subsidy levels in the European Union, for example. But one can also acknowledge that these international negotiations did actually quite a lot to make the subsidies far less trade distorting. This move to direct income transfers, which is not as damaging for the rest of the world. I think that could be attributed, and David Orden is here, he may have some additional perspectives on that point. There's also discussion on how important or how powerful are organizations like the World Bank or the FAO, which is also an interesting point in your description. The World Bank doesn't really have that much influence. Many of the structural adjustment programs you point out have not really been implemented. But I think one has to acknowledge that the funding that the World Bank has dwarfs that of many other organizations. And they also have some intellectual leadership in many areas. So I would perhaps disagree on that point. There's a discussion on the CGIAR. One could probably point out the expansion of their mandate and how far they should really go. And the question of the FAO and whether it can be reformed is an important one that's brought up. What could be discussed but is not really there is what role do these organizations like the G8 or G20 play, which is where the real power is, but they operate outside the formal UN procedures. And finally, because that may be of particular interest to IFPRI and to all of you, the role of development assistance. So in the final chapter, the book asks the very important question, is development assistance from rich country the answer to hunger in Africa? And the punchline is that it is national governments that have been responsible, and it was national governments that failed to deliver. And again, in view of your summary, an interesting question would be, to what extent is it external factors like environmental groups that account for this, or to what extent are there other factors? And I think another important question is, if we look into the future, in the past, okay, they have failed to deliver. But if we look in the future, are national governments, they in Africa, more able to deliver? And here my argument would be that in the future, the prospects for the future are actually much better than they were in the past. We have a dramatic decline in armed conflicts that has made it difficult to achieve food security. Countries do have more macroeconomic stability. We do have more civil society organizations. Okay, they may have negative influence, as you pointed out in your summary, but I think they also have a lot of very positive influence because they can help to hold governments accountable, just as the emerging private sector in many countries can. And I think in many countries we also have more democracy, and that's an important internal factor in the politics of food of developing countries, more voice for rural people. And one recommendation I would like to conclude with is that development aid could try to foster rather than undermine democratic institutions, and that would be a good contribution to food security. So taken all together, it was really fascinating to read the book, and I look forward to further discussions.